For months, one voice kept saying the same thing, that this quarterback wasn't it. No matter what showed up on the field, the verdict never changed. He wasn't ready. He couldn't make the throws. He didn't see the game fast enough. And no matter how many fans pushed back, that narrative stayed locked in. Until it didn't. Because there's a moment every media storyline eventually runs into reality. And when that moment arrives, the loudest critics usually have two choices: double down or quietly reverse course. What happened here wasn't quiet. What makes this situation different isn't just that a take aged badly. It's how confident the criticism was, how often it was repeated, and how aggressively it dismissed what everyone else was watching unfold in real time. This wasn't skepticism. It was certainty. And certainty is dangerous when the receipts are still being written on the field. Then came the games that weren't supposed to matter, the throws that couldn't be made, the situations he supposedly couldn't handle. One by one, those talking points started collapsing, not through debate, but through performance. And suddenly, the same voice that spent months tearing him down was forced to acknowledge something it never wanted to admit. Not because of hype, not because of pressure from fans, but because denying it any longer would have meant denying what everyone could clearly see. This isn't just about a quarterback proving people wrong. It's about how fast a narrative can flip when the truth shows up uninvited. And once it did, there was no way to walk it back without everyone noticing. And that's where this story really begins. From the very beginning, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders never felt neutral. It wasn't framed as, "let's wait and see," or "there are areas to improve." Instead, it came across as a conclusion that had already been reached, and nothing that happened on the field seemed capable of changing it. Week after week, the same criticisms resurfaced almost word for word. He couldn't read defenses fast enough. He didn't anticipate windows. He relied too heavily on open receivers, and most importantly, he was the guy. These weren't offhand remarks or heat-of-the-moment reactions. They were delivered with confidence, as if the case was already closed. At the center of that conversation was Lloyd, a media figure whose voice carried weight in the local football ecosystem. His assessments weren't framed as possibilities or concerns. They were definitive statements. And once those statements were out there, they became the backbone of a larger narrative that spread far beyond one show or one article. What made it more frustrating for fans wasn't just the criticism itself. It was the timing. Even as Sanders continued to produce, even as he showed improvement and composure in live game situations, the commentary didn't evolve. Good performances were minimized. Big moments were brushed off as exceptions, and anything that didn't fit the established storyline was treated as irrelevant. This is how narratives become stubborn. When analysis stops reacting to new information and starts protecting old opinions, the goalposts begin to move. Suddenly, it's not about what the quarterback did, it's about what he hasn't done yet. Not about execution, but about imaginary tests that keep getting postponed. And the more confidently those criticisms were repeated, the more they shaped public perception. Casual viewers heard the same points echoed again and again, until they started sounding like facts instead of opinions. That repetition mattered, because once a narrative hardens, breaking it takes more than solid play. It takes moments so undeniable they force a reaction. At this stage, that reaction hadn't come yet. The criticism remained loud. The tone remained dismissive, and the idea that this quarterback could actually be the future was treated like wishful thinking rather than a real possibility. But underneath all of that noise, the cracks were already forming. Because when a narrative refuses to adapt, it only takes one real test, one undeniable moment, for everything to start unraveling. The criticism didn't stay vague, it got specific, almost surgical. According to the narrative being pushed, Shedeur Sanders wasn't just flawed, he was fundamentally limited. The list of supposed deficiencies kept growing, and each one was framed as a non-negotiable reason he could never be the answer. He couldn't throw into tight windows. He didn't throw receivers open. He didn't recognize pressure. He didn't understand protections. He only succeeded when everything around him was perfect. Those claims weren't presented as areas for growth. They were delivered as hard truths, final judgments, and once those labels were attached, they followed him everywhere, no matter what actually happened during the games. What made these accusations so bold was how absolute they were. Saying a young quarterback needs refinement is normal. Saying he cannot do something, especially something that shows up on film, is risky. Because the moment evidence appears, the entire argument collapses at once. But instead of backing off, the criticism doubled down. Every completion was reframed as safe. Every touchdown was credited to the system. Any sign of composure was brushed aside as coincidence. And when Sanders avoided mistakes, it wasn't praised. It was dismissed as unsustainable. This is where analysis quietly crossed into narrative enforcement. Rather than reacting to what was happening, the commentary started protecting earlier takes. The logic became circular. If he played well, it didn't count. If he struggled, it proved the point. Either way, the conclusion never changed. And that approach only worked as long as the game stayed abstract. As long as moments could be explained away with words. Because the second a quarterback does the exact thing he's accused of being incapable of doing in real time, under pressure, explanations stop working. That's what made these claims so fragile. They depended on the idea that fans weren't really watching, that they'd accept descriptions over evidence, that a confident voice could outweigh what unfolded on the field. But football doesn't operate in hypotheticals. It exposes exaggeration fast. Tight windows exist or they don't. Anticipation shows up or it doesn't. Pressure either breaks a quarterback or it doesn't. And as these claims kept getting repeated, they quietly raised the stakes. Because now, it wasn't just about whether Sanders could succeed. It was about whether the loudest criticisms would survive direct confrontation with reality. And that confrontation was closer than anyone realized. The thing about bold claims is that they hold up only until the game forces an answer. And for Shedeur Sanders, that answer didn't come in the form of a long speech or a social media post. It came in a single moment that unfolded too fast to explain away. It was the kind of situation critics said he couldn't handle: tight coverage, limited space, pressure building, no bailout option. Exactly the scenario that was supposed to expose every weakness people insisted he had. The defense didn't make it easy. Two defenders closed in, shrinking the window down to almost nothing. The timing had to be perfect. The placement had to be exact. A fraction late or a few inches off and the play dies, or worse, flips momentum the other way. Instead, the ball arrived where only the receiver could touch it. No hesitation, no panic, just anticipation, touch, and confidence. The kind that doesn't show up on a stat sheet but shows up clearly on film. The result wasn't just a completion, it was a statement. A direct contradiction to everything that had been said about what he supposedly couldn't do. This wasn't a broken coverage. It wasn't a blown assignment. It wasn't a receiver running free. It was a tight window throw against real pressure, the exact thing critics had insisted didn't exist in his game. And that's what made the moment so uncomfortable for the narrative. Because once fans saw it, they couldn't unsee it. You could pause the clip, rewind it, slow it down. The evidence stayed the same. No amount of commentary could change what the frame-by-frame showed. What followed was silence, not immediately, but noticeably. The kind that happens when talking points no longer fit cleanly. Because explaining that play away would have required admitting the earlier claims were overstated at best, flat-out wrong at worst. And the bigger issue, that throw wasn't an outlier. It just happened to be the most obvious example. The type of play that forces a recalibration whether someone wants to make it or not. From that moment on, the conversation subtly shifted. The criticism didn't disappear, but it softened. It became less confident, less absolute. Because once a quarterback proves he can do the very thing he's accused of being incapable of, the foundation of the argument starts cracking. And those cracks only get wider when more moments follow. You'd think a moment like that would end the debate. It didn't. Instead, the conversation took a familiar turn, the kind that happens when a narrative runs out of room but refuses to collapse. Rather than admit the evaluation might have been off, the standard quietly changed. Now it wasn't about whether Shedeur Sanders could make the throws. It was about when he made them, who he made them against, whether the moment was big enough. The questions multiplied just as fast as the answers became inconvenient. Suddenly, one impressive game wasn't enough. One tight window throw was framed as a fluke. Consistency became the new test, except the definition of consistency kept shifting. If he played well, it was just 1 week. If he followed it up, it was still not against the right competition. There was always another condition waiting in the wings. This is where the criticism stopped sounding analytical and started sounding emotional. The tone hardened. Frustration slipped into the delivery, and instead of adjusting the take, the commentary doubled down on dismissal. It wasn't just skepticism anymore, it felt personal. At the center of it was Jason Lloyd, whose reactions grew sharper as the on-field evidence stacked up. The language became more absolute, not less. The declarations louder, almost as if conceding even a small point would unravel everything that had been said before. And that's the trap of public certainty. Once you've spent months telling people a player is not the answer, walking that back doesn't just require admitting you were wrong. It requires explaining why you were so sure in the first place. That's a hard pill for anyone with a platform to swallow. So instead of acknowledgement, there were tantrums. Instead of recalibration, there was deflection. The focus shifted away from execution and toward hypothetical shortcomings that couldn't be disproven in a single play. Leadership, command, feel for the game. Vague ideas that sound serious but are impossible to measure cleanly. Meanwhile, Sanders wasn't even getting the benefit of ideal conditions. He wasn't surrounded by a locked-in first unit. He wasn't being protected by excuses. Yet the criticism never adjusted for context. It only tightened. That's when fans started noticing the pattern. Not because they were blind supporters, but because the reaction stopped matching the reality on the field. Praise was withheld. Progress was minimized. And the bar kept rising just out of reach. But moving the goalposts only works for so long. Eventually, the game forces you to defend a position that no longer makes sense. And when that happens, the entire argument starts to look less like analysis and more like an agenda. As the original narrative started losing ground, a new angle quietly entered the conversation. Instead of debating whether Shedeur Sanders was improving, attention shifted to someone else entirely. A different quarterback, a different skill set, a different story that, conveniently, didn't require revisiting earlier claims. That's when Dillon Gabriel was pushed forward as the alternative. The argument sounded reasonable on the surface. He was described as safer, more controlled, better at managing the offense, someone who could keep the chains moving and avoid mistakes. It was framed as practicality over flash, efficiency over upside. And for a moment, that framing worked. But the deeper fans looked, the less it held together. Because while Gabriel was being praised for traits like decision-making and accuracy, the on-field results didn't consistently back up the hype. Missed throws showed up. Timing looked off. Simple completions became inconsistent. And in moments where rhythm mattered most, execution often lagged behind the description. Yet those flaws were brushed aside, not analyzed, not emphasized, not repeated. They were treated as footnotes instead of red flags. That contrast was impossible to ignore. When Sanders made a mistake, it was magnified. When Gabriel struggled, it was contextualized. When Sanders succeeded, it was minimized. When Gabriel flashed competence, it was amplified. Two quarterbacks, two very different standards. And that's when fans started questioning the comparison itself. Not because Gabriel lacked talent, but because the evaluation felt selective. One player's film was dissected frame by frame. The other's was summarized in theory. One was judged on outcomes, the other on intentions. The irony: many of the traits Gabriel was being credited for, quick decision-making, composure, ball placement, were the same traits Sanders had already shown under far more pressure, against tougher defenses, in situations where mistakes actually mattered. At that point, the comparison stopped feeling like analysis and started feeling like deflection, a way to avoid addressing what was happening right in front of everyone. Because admitting Sanders was outperforming expectations would have meant revisiting months of certainty. And that's the problem with swapping narratives midstream. It doesn't erase the original claims, it just highlights how fragile they were to begin with. Because while the conversation shifted toward hypotheticals, Sanders kept stacking real moments, real drives, real responses under pressure. And the more that happened, the harder it became to justify why someone else needed to be propped up to explain him away. That's when the focus had no choice but to return to the field, where the story was becoming impossible to ignore. This is where the conversation should have ended, because this is where excuses stop working. When the game tightens, when the margin disappears, when there's no script left to hide behind, quarterbacks either rise or get exposed. And for Shedeur Sanders, this was the stretch critics had been waiting for. The first real test came against the Tennessee Titans. The situation couldn't have been more uncomfortable. Down 13-3 in the second half. Momentum gone, pressure mounting. This was the exact scenario people said would overwhelm him. When anticipation breaks down, reads get rushed and mistakes pile up. That didn't happen. Instead, Sanders settled in. The offense started moving, not with desperation throws, but with control. Reads came faster, placement stayed sharp. And as the deficit shrank, the confidence became visible. Drive after drive, the narrative lost more ground. By the end of the game, the numbers told a story critics couldn't dodge. 364 yards through the air and 4 touchdowns in a comeback that flipped the entire tone of the conversation. That performance wasn't flashy for the sake of flash. It was surgical, calm, the kind of showing that separates talent from command. And most importantly, it came when the outcome was still very much in doubt. Then came the follow-up, because one big game can still be dismissed if it's not repeated. Against the Las Vegas Raiders, the pressure returned in a different form. A closer game, less room to breathe. A 10-7 halftime deficit that required patience instead of panic. Once again, Sanders didn't force anything. He adjusted. The second half told the real story. Over 200 passing yards, 3 touchdowns, complete control of tempo. What started as a narrow gap turned into a decisive 24-10 win. No chaos, no reckless decisions, just steady execution when the moment demanded it. This was the stretch that made the criticism collapse under its own weight, because these weren't highlight throws in garbage time. These were response drives, momentum-shifting plays, situations where leadership isn't talked about, it's shown. And through all of it, Sanders didn't engage the noise. No gestures, no statements, no visible frustration. He just kept delivering. That's what made this run different. It wasn't one play or one throw anymore. It was a pattern. A quarterback answering every new condition that had been placed in front of him, calmly, consistently, and without explanation. At that point, the question was no longer whether he could handle pressure. It was how long anyone could keep pretending he hadn't already done it. At some point, talk stops mattering because action starts speaking louder. And this was the moment when the conversation shifted away from media voices entirely and toward the people whose decisions actually shape a franchise. Because while debates were still playing out publicly, the Cleveland Browns were already moving in a very different direction behind the scenes. It started quietly. No press conference, no announcement, just a moment that didn't need explaining to anyone who understands how the league works. After one of those performances, the kind that flips games and locker rooms, Browns general manager Andrew Berry didn't send a message through the media. He didn't wait for analysts to weigh in. He walked straight into the locker room to personally congratulate Shedeur Sanders. That matters. General managers don't do that casually, especially with young quarterbacks. They do it when they see command, when they see buy-in, when they see something that doesn't need debate. That moment wasn't about stats, it was about belief. And belief at that level doesn't show up unless it's backed by film, preparation, and trust. But that wasn't the only signal. Soon after, reports surfaced that Browns owner Jimmy Haslam had met with Shedeur Sanders, Shedeur's father. In a league where optics matter and moves are calculated, that meeting spoke volumes. Ownership doesn't step into those conversations unless the direction is serious. And just like that, the speculation changed tone. What once sounded like debate started sounding like confirmation. Not because anyone said the words out loud, but because the actions lined up too cleanly to ignore. Front offices don't operate on hype. They operate on risk management. And everything about these moves suggested the Browns were no longer evaluating whether Shedeur could be the future. They were preparing for the reality that he already was. That's when the media narrative officially lost control of the story. Because once the organization signals confidence, outside criticism loses leverage. You can question fit, you can nitpick mechanics, but you can't argue with alignment between performance, coaching trust, and executive support. And that alignment exposed the gap between opinion and reality. While some voices were still clinging to old talking points, the Browns were making decisions that suggested the evaluation phase was over. At that point, the shift was inevitable. Because when the people with the most to lose put their weight behind a quarterback, it forces everyone else to reconsider their stance. And for those who had spent months insisting this outcome would never happen, there was only one option left: to finally acknowledge what had already become obvious. Once the organization made its stance clear, there was nowhere left to hide. The debate wasn't just tilting anymore, it was over. And when that happens, even the loudest critics are forced into an uncomfortable position. Because continuing to deny reality doesn't just look stubborn, it looks disconnected. That's when the tone finally changed. For months, Lloyd had spoken with certainty. Not caution, not curiosity, certainty. He didn't frame his criticism as something that might evolve, he framed it as something already decided. Which is exactly why the reversal mattered so much. Because this wasn't a small adjustment. It wasn't a quiet, maybe I was too harsh. It was a visible pullback from a stance that had been defended repeatedly, even aggressively. The same quarterback who supposedly couldn't execute, couldn't lead, and couldn't be trusted was now being spoken about very differently. And that shift didn't come with new film or new circumstances. It came after the performances, after the comebacks, after the front office actions, after the evidence stacked too high to keep dismissing. That's what made the backtrack so revealing. It wasn't framed as growth or reconsideration. It felt like surrender, like someone realizing the argument had collapsed under its own weight, and continuing to push it would only damage credibility further. Because once fans saw the disconnect, once they noticed how long the criticism held on despite mounting proof, the trust was already strained. And this is the part that rarely gets talked about. In sports media, being wrong isn't the real issue. It happens to everyone. The issue is refusing to adjust when new information arrives. That's when analysis turns into agenda and confidence turns into blind spots. What unfolded here wasn't just a quarterback earning respect. It was a narrative being forced to correct itself in public. And those moments are always awkward because they expose how much of the conversation was built on repetition instead of reassessment. For viewers, it was a reminder of how powerful confident voices can be and how quickly that power fades when reality stops cooperating. The same takes that once sounded authoritative suddenly felt outdated. The same certainty now felt rushed. And by the time the acknowledgement came, it almost didn't matter anymore. Because the damage wasn't to the quarterback's reputation, that had already been repaired on the field. The damage was to the credibility of the criticism itself. In the end, the backtrack didn't elevate the conversation, it closed it. Because once someone spends months insisting a player is not the answer, only to concede after the evidence becomes overwhelming, the real takeaway isn't about football. It's about how easily narratives harden and how painfully they break when the truth refuses to stay quiet. By the time the backtracking happened, the story was already finished. Not because anyone declared a winner, but because the evidence had done all the talking. What started as doubt slowly turned into resistance, and eventually into silence, the kind that comes when there's nothing left to argue. For Shedeur Sanders, this wasn't about winning over critics or chasing validation. It was about surviving a narrative that refused to move until it was forced to. He didn't respond with words. He didn't campaign for approval. He let the game handle it, one possession at a time. That's what made the shift so definitive. The criticism didn't fade because it was debated away. It faded because it became impossible to defend. Tight window throws showed up. Pressure situations were handled. Comebacks happened. And when the moment demanded calm instead of chaos, Sanders delivered without hesitation. Meanwhile, the Cleveland Browns made their position clear without ever needing to announce it. Locker room trust, executive confidence, ownership alignment. Those aren't reactions, they're commitments. And once those pieces fell into place, the rest of the conversation became background noise. What this entire sequence really exposed wasn't just a misread on a quarterback. It exposed how quickly certainty can turn into stubbornness, and how hard it is for public narratives to admit they've fallen behind reality. Being wrong isn't fatal. Refusing to adjust is. And that's why this moment matters beyond one season or one player. Because it's a reminder that performance always gets the final word, not opinions, not agendas, not repetition. Right now, the narrative has flipped. The same player once dismissed as not the answer is now being viewed as the future. And the shift didn't happen overnight. It happened possession by possession, drive by drive, under pressure that was supposed to break him. The only real question left isn't whether Shedeur Sanders belongs. It's how long it took for the conversation to catch up to what the field had already decided.